There are two famous objections to God's existence that I think ring down through the ages and remain perennially important and valid. They're both named by Aquinas with clarity and fairness. One is the idea that the natural causes of this world are sufficient in and of themselves to explain reality. You might say that God is an unnecessary hypothesis, or maybe even just an unintelligible hypothesis to explaining the world, so that when we examine the natural order, we kind of come to a comprehensive understanding of everything only through the examination of the immanent natural structures of reality. The second famous objection is the objection from evil, that there is too much natural and moral evil in the world for a person to reasonably believe that there is a transcendent creator of the order of reality who is good and omnipotent and who cares for the world. So natural evil would be things that would derive from the natural failures of the world order, say earthquakes or natural blindness or cancer or physical suffering, and moral causality would be the weakness and frailty of the human will or the human agent in our vast number of human political and moral catastrophes wherein human beings treat each other with terrible cruelty, and there doesn't seem to be a kind of vindication of justice in the natural order. So both of these objections they raise massive issues. They raise fundamental philosophical questions that cannot really be relegated to a short video or answered in a summary fashion. But we can indicate some initial intuitive places of response that are important. Regarding natural causality, the real issue is it sufficient just to explain things through their material physical causes, or are human beings capable of asking what we might call deeper metaphysical questions? And indeed, must we, to be really intellectually honest, probing people, ask deeper metaphysical questions about the nature of things? So when I say metaphysical questions, these are fairly commonsensical, although they're deep. So this is questions like, what is causality in the end? Is it really just relegated to material physical aspects of things? Do we understand, for example, what a human being is when we understand just the atomic chemical structure of the human being? Or there are other aspects like rational motivations or nature's formal causes, as they're called in Aristotelian terminology, that we need to examine to understand what a thing is. So, Aristotle thinks there are four causes. The formal or natural cause, like being a human being, is what you are formally, essentially. There's material causality, what you're made of. There's essential causality, where you come from, what gives rise to a thing. And there's final causality, purposes or orientations towards meaning or the horizon of behavior that orients a thing, be it an animal or a plant or a human being, what we strive for as purposes. When you get into that kind of complexity of the causes and you start to think about what human beings are, why they are, and just more generally natural realities, then deeper metaphysical questions do arise. I mean, namely, like the contingency question, why things come to be. And you can ultimately ask questions about why there are any beings at all. If everything is contingent, then is that a sufficient explanation of reality, just to talk about an infinite series of contingent beings giving rise to one another? You can raise questions actually from this intelligible structure of matter. Why is the material structure intelligible? Why are human beings capable of understanding the world scientifically and mathematically? Does human abstract thinking really derive uniquely from a material source? Or when we think abstractly and universally, does that denote something spiritual in us? Can human free will be explained only by material causes in us? Are we more than a bundle of animal impulses? Is there something spiritual, deliberate, rational, free in us that requires a higher form of explanation? What kind of explanation should we give to beauty in the world? And does the order of beauty denote some kind of higher and transcendent dimension of reality? These are good questions. They're not easy questions, but they open the door to true metaphysical questions, and they lift the curtain back so that you see that this kind of purely naturalistic immanentism, where everything's just explained through modern science or natural causality, probably isn't sufficient for a kind of probing, intellectual, honest investigation of reality. So people have, really important conversations still about this. They will perennially have this argument about whether we can ask metaphysical questions and whether metaphysical questions lead to God. That's not because metaphysics is something arbitrary, but it's because it's difficult, and it requires a real deep tradition of reflection in human culture to sustain metaphysical reflection, and we invest in the modern sciences as a culture much more than we do in metaphysics. But there can be a kind of higher ground of human learning about causality that we're capable of, and that's why metaphysics does remain perennially important. For the argument from evil, which many people consider the stronger argument, this is not really subject to a short answer, but I would say this. The fundamental thing to remember is that in the tradition, from Augustine and Aquinas, it's rightly argued that evil is a privation of the good. So precisely what we mean when we talk about evil is that there's failures in the natural order of goodness, and that sometimes where we expect to find the natural good, like sight, we find the privation of that good, like the natural evil of blindness. Or where we desire to see health, we find sickness. But also in the moral order, where we desire to see virtue or fairness or justice, we find unfairness or harshness of soul and mind, and we find injustice, or we find malice, selfishness, egoism. But precisely because those are, you might say, defections from the good and privations of right order toward goodness, charity, justice, virtue, we can judge them to be evils. I mean, the irony is we actually only can name them as evils because there's something missing, and what's missing is the good. So every time we make an argument from the reality of evil to the fact that there's not an order of goodness, we're actually, you might say, metaphysical parasites, because we're actually trying to convict reality of an absence of something we know is there and should be there in greater plenitude, or claim there should be there in greater plenitude, which is goodness. So the more we look at the kind of metaphysical roots of evil, the more we have to ask the question, what's primary in reality, and why are there good things in reality, both in the natural order and the moral order, that have an intelligibility and that create in us an expectation? And that raises the question of whether there's a transcendent, sovereignly and infinitely good source and origin of reality, who is God. And that argument can be made, I think, convict in a sort of coherent and reasonable way. The problem then becomes, if God exists, why do finite goods exist that can fail in their goodness? And what is God up to? What is the world about that we would have so much natural and moral evil in it? And that is a topic that you can answer in part philosophically by looking at how the human being can strive to live a noble, virtuous, and even religious life in the face of moral and natural evil, and the expectation perhaps of immortality, of the soul's life with God beyond this world. And that's Plato's answer, and Aristotle's got passages in his work that suggest that answer. But ultimately, that's where you can, I think, even reasonably from a philosophical point of view, decide to look to the religious traditions and to divine revelation to see if there's evidences that God has involved himself in our world in such a way as to answer the problem of evil from a higher ground or from a higher source. And that's really where the Catholic philosopher, the Christian philosopher, will point towards the mystery of Christ and the mystery of grace and redemption and the cross and the resurrection to treat and adjudicate the discernments about the question of evil and good.